Okay, welcome back to Physics 1020-1090. This is the lecture from Monday, March 16th. We're covering Chapter 4, Wave Optics. This is the second video of the lecture, talking about bubbles. Why are we talking about bubbles? Well, if you look in your book, on figure 24.7, you see a picture of bubbles here. And you've all played with bubbles. You all blown bubbles as a kid. You know that the bubbles they look rather colorful and they kind of shiny and they have different colors coming off at different spots, like is shown here. What we're going to try to understand is why that happens. What's causing all those reflections off the bubble, and why does the color change so much? So, let us analyze bubbles. A bubble is basically air on the outside, air on the inside, and a layer of water in between. Yes, it requires some soap to make the surface tension so you get the bubble, but it's basically air, water, air. Now, in order to understand, we're going to try to reflect light off of these bubbles and look at thin film interference. In order to understand that, we need one more concept, this concept about phase changes. In particular, the phase change upon reflection that occurs on a surface. So let's talk about phase changes. Okay, here is a light ray going from water into air. Water has a higher index of refraction than air. Water is about 1.33, air is about 1. So the light. Now what we're going to do is we're using a picture kind of like what I did in class when I was talking about Young's experiment. I had those colored papers that the students held, and when the paper is dark, that corresponded to the electric field going one direction, and the color is light, the electric field was going back the other direction, and then dark back. And so from here where the electric field goes dark, becomes dark, white, and then to here, that's one wavelength of the light. So we have two wavelengths coming down, dark white. It hits the surface and it reflects. Well, dark white, the next one should be dark, and that's what it is, dark white. So you might, so what happens is at this surface, you don't get any sort of phase change. Nothing funny happens. It just goes dark white, as you'd expect. This is what happens when you go from a high index of refraction material, water, into a low index of refraction material, air. Now, when you go the other way, things get more complicated. When you go from air, low index of refraction, to water, high index, what you have is a phase change. You have dark white, and the next one should be dark. But there's a phase change of 180 degrees upon the reflection. And by that, I mean that what should have been dark becomes white. So you have dark white, dark, white, dark, white, dark. So this extra 180 degree phase change is the key to understanding how bubbles work. It only happens when you go from low index into high index refraction. Now, how do we explain this? Well, what happens is essentially this acts like it turns constructive into destructive interference. You might expect to get destructive interference if you had two rays that were the same phase. You would get constructive interference. But if you had one that underwent this phase change, you now have a condition for destructive interference. So oftentimes you'll find that what you think should give you constructive interference because of the phase change gives you destructive. Just to review, here's the two cases sitting side by side. When you go from water to air, that is high index of refraction to low index of refraction, there's no phase change upon the reflection. But when you go from low index to high index, there is a phase change. So the key difference is to notice that this reflected ray here is at a different phase than the reflected wave there. Same wavelength, same properties, a different phase shift was introduced from the reflection. Okay, so here's our bubble. This is actually the bubble is a huge thing now. We're focusing in very closely at the wall of the bubble. So the bubble is a great big thing here that goes forever. This is the outside in the air, this is the inside in the air, and this is the very thin wall of the bubble. Light comes in and it hits the top air water surface and reflects. Now you're going from air to water. You get 180-degree phase change in the phase of that light. Then some of it gets transmitted and reflects off this lower surface and comes back up and goes out. That second reflection is water to air. That goes from high index to low index. It does not give you a phase change. So what you have now is a phase change on the top surface, no phase change on the bottom surface. So why are we going to, so what are we going to do? We're going to look at the interference between this reflected ray and that reflected ray. There's two reflected rays, and we want to examine their interference. They're already 180 degrees out of phase because of the phase change. So we want to also include a shift in phase because this one had to go an extra distance. Just like in Young's experiment, extra distance introduces a shift in phase. What's the extra distance? It's 2 times d, the round trip distance through the layer. So the extra distance is 2d, and we want that to be half of a wavelength. Now you might be thinking to yourself, half of a wavelength? I thought that corresponded to destructive interference. Well, it would, except you had that half a wavelength phase shift, or 180-degree phase shift upon reflection at one of the surfaces that introduced another phase shift. So if you have a half a wavelength from the extra distance and half a wavelength from the reflections, that gives you a total phase shift of 1 wavelength, which would correspond to constructive interference. So you get the extra distance, 2d, is equal to the wavelength in the water divided by 2. And because of the phase shifts at the surfaces, that's going to correspond to constructive interference. You're going to get that light brightly reflected. That would correspond to a distance d is equal to lambda, where in this case lambda without the subscripts water is the wavelength in the vacuum, divided by 4 times n. N is the index of refraction of water. Basically, the wavelength in water is equal to the wavelength in vacuum over the index of refraction. Suppose you want a destructive interference. Now you have the extra distance is going to correspond to an entire wavelength. An entire wavelength, you might think, well, that should be constructive. But with the extra phase shifts at the surfaces, you get destructive interference. And other thicknesses, you could have 3/2 wavelength. If it was a little thicker, you now have the extra distance is 3/2 of a wavelength. And because of the phase shifts at the reflections, that's constructive interference, and you end up getting light reflected off. Now, what happens with these bubbles? With the bubbles, the surface of the bubble doesn't have a uniform thickness. Sometimes the thickness is thicker in some places than others. So when the light comes down and hits it, in some places you get constructive, and some places you get destructive interference. And remember what we said last class. The amount of constructive or destructive interference depends on the color of the light. So at some spots, you might have just the condition for constructive interference for green light. And in another position with a little bit different thickness, green light won't be undergoing constructive interference, but red light will be, or blue light. So what you end up getting is all these different colors over the surface of the bubble because the bubble surface is ununiform in thickness. Okay, one more question I have for you. Why did we not see these phase shifts in that thin film experiment I did in the first video? Because in that experiment, we went from air to film, that's going into a larger index of refraction, and then film to glass, and that was also going into the larger index of refraction. So we should have had phase changes in those cases, but I didn't bring them up. Well, the reason is you had phase changes at both reflections, from air to film and then from film to glass in the last video. If both of them undergo 180-degree phase shift, their relative phase is unchanged. So we didn't need to worry about them because the relative phase shift between the two reflected rays was unchanged. But when you have a phase shift in one surface and not the other, you have to take it into account. That is bubbles. The next thing we're going to talk about in the next video is diffraction.